Hey everyone, my name is Paras Chopra, and today I'm with Gaige Clark, who's studying psychology at UC Merced, focusing on neuroscience, pharmacology, and neuropsychology, especially in relation to psychedelic therapy. He reads bucket loads of papers on the science of mental disorders and documents them on his blog Quirky Science. And his blog is much beyond just mental disorders, but going through his blog you'll realize he has a deep interest in talking about how we feel things, right from subjective experiences to consciousness to he's just widely interested in different aspects when it comes to the mental domain. So through personal experiments and emerging support in science, he now believes in the hypothesis that psychedelics may treat schizophrenia. And this hypothesis is both scientifically and medically very interesting. And today I'm going to explore it in detail with Gaige. So welcome, Gaige.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. So Gaige, I wanted to start with understanding a little bit about your background. How did you get interested in researching the science of psychedelics and in general getting more interested in science of, say, the mind?
So it kind of started in a weird way. I used to be like really, well, I probably still am really hypochondriac. And this was like in high school or maybe even earlier. I would start like researching different things. And so I was also put on medication for like depression and ADHD. And I would get side effects and stuff, and I would just get curious, like, what is this doing to me? And so I started off reading about a lot of that stuff, and it started off like with more kind of physical things, I guess you could say, even though everything is really kind of physical. But like I would get interested in like diabetes, or like I got really into multiple sclerosis at first, and then as time passed, I got really interested in things like hallucinations and stuff like that. And during high school, I actually would get like hypnagogic hallucinations, which are like as you fall asleep, you might see something for a couple seconds. And I started getting that a lot. And I was on this medication that would induce sleepiness. And it kind of its mechanisms kind of overlapped with what might be called deliriant drugs. It's kind of like Benadryl in a way. And I found out people were purposely like trying to hallucinate on things like that. And then I just would like read tons of stories of people trying to trip out on things. And then I just got more and more generally curious about how does all of this work? Like, why could something like this small chemical do something like that?
Right.
I don't know. So there's that. And then moving into like currently, now it's kind of a lot of things. I kind of get motivated to, well, I should also mention my mom seemed to have something like schizophrenia. And so that's like another big factor. And I, like how I mentioned those hypnagogic hallucinations, there were a lot of phases in my life where I would get like paranoid and stuff, but I wouldn't get really fully, like, I guess, crazy, if you want to call it that. But I would get paranoid, and I would kind of be aware of the fact that the things I was thinking were potentially wrong. And so I got like really, well, so the other thing with that though, I mean, I was on ADHD medication, which can do that. It can actually like induce like paranoia. It's a stimulant. And I don't use that anymore, so I don't really get the same problems as much. But anyway, so now I'm at UC Merced, and it's been kind of a rough trail, like as I mentioned, with my mom being seemingly schizophrenic. She actually like passed away when I was at the beginning of my college. And so that kind of like set me back. Like I ended up having to figure out like how to live and where to go. And I don't know, it kind of just like threw me off. And I ended up getting really into just reading the literature. And I had this like crazy mindset, like I'm just going to keep reading the literature until I'm like really good at this stuff. And it ended up really good, but at first it was kind of weird because I wasn't doing that good in school because of just a lot of it was naivety and a lot of it was all the troubles that I was going through. So I had like I ended up like kind of just getting really into like self-studying, and I would like neglect my classes and do badly. Yeah. And so now I'm like 28 and I'm about to get my bachelor's degree, but I'm also like connected with a bunch of people that are like PhDs and different things like that through the internet, or like on my campus, I talk to some of them. And yeah, so that's kind of it, I think. Sorry if that was like so long.
No, I think that's a great sort of setting for our conversation ahead. So Gaige, for people who don't know what schizophrenia is, or who may have never come across someone with schizophrenic symptoms, how would you describe this disorder?
Okay, so this is a little tricky only because I disagree with certain things about the way that it's conceptualized, but in general, the general idea would be, or at least the popular viewpoint would be that it's basically this disorder where it sets in around like 20s for most people. Not always, though. It can set in earlier or later. It tends to like what people would often describe it as is like you slowly get kind of crazier. Like you start off in what's called a prodrome, and then you slowly reach like full blown schizophrenia after having like maybe like a psychotic episode. And so like some of the symptoms that people will get in general would be like anhedonia, where they're like totally unmotivated. They feel like numb oftentimes. And there's like flat affect, which kind of goes along with that, where people just kind of have like this flat expression, no emotion. Then there's like paranoia. So like they'll often categorize it as two different types of symptoms. There's negative and positive symptoms, and that doesn't have anything to do with whether they're good or bad, but it has to do with like negative would be things that are taken away from a person. And I think this is really like a like debatable conceptualization as well. But so like there's taken away symptoms, and then there's additive symptoms, which would be like hallucinations or delusions. And negative would be like less motivation, less ability to think, less emotion or something like that. And so they'll often will experience hallucinations. That's kind of like what the disorder is popularly known for, is delusions and hallucinations. You don't actually necessarily have to hallucinate to be schizophrenic. Like there's people that will just be like paranoid and delusional, for example. But yeah, that pretty much is the answer to that.
Okay. And what's the incidence rate of this, or how common this is? I know depression is very common as a mental disorder. Is schizophrenia also sort of like a similar league?
Yeah, I think it's like 1% or 1 to 2% of the population. I think most people have probably actually experienced some of these symptoms, but the people that get diagnosed, it's 1 to 2%. And I think a lot of people, like, it's a really stigmatized disorder.
Yeah.
So like people don't want to be diagnosed this. So like if someone were to start hallucinating, there's like a real possibility that they would just not tell anybody because it's like really shameful. And so it's possible that it's more common than, like, it's probably underdiagnosed, but it's 1 to 2%.
Yeah, I mean, even 1 to 2% is a huge population, and I would presume, I mean, since you said your mom had schizophrenia or symptoms like schizophrenia, it does impact the quality of life significantly.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's like one of the ways I view schizophrenia is that, like, a lot of mental health problems are, in my opinion, I think that they're kind of responses to stress, usually, not all of them. But a lot of the things like depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, particularly, I think are kind of disorders of stress where, like, if you're a little bit stressed, you might be anxious, but if you're like a crazy amount of stress or like totally like traumatized regularly or something like that, I think you will begin to experience the type of symptoms that people with schizophrenia have. So, yeah, I think like schizophrenia is basically like the tail end of a low quality of life, if you want to put it that way.
Right, right. And I was reading somewhere, I mean, and they were saying, like you're exactly saying, there's a lot of commonality. I mean, there seems to be a common factor across mental disorders, because even psychiatrists have difficulty classifying, and different psychiatrists would sometimes classify a patient as having different disorders. But is it true that some of these disorders, and maybe particularly schizophrenia, there's also like a genetic component in this, apart from, say, stress? And stress also seems like a big catch-all. Do you want to sort of maybe describe it? What exactly did you mean when you said stress can cause this?
So I would say, I think genetics and mental health, it is almost one of the trickiest topics. It is one that I end up wanting to debate a lot on. But so, like, the thing with genetics, like, if we take this idea of stress, stress can be genetic. So, like, your stress proneness would be a huge genetic aspect to this. Like, how badly does stress feel? How intensely does stress produce side effects? And so there'll be like kind of like a bell curve of people that can handle stress. And like on the far end, you might have people that are very immune to stress. And like a lot of times people will kind of argue that that's what psychopathy might be, that like people who don't feel stress or fear are kind of on the psychopathic side of the spectrum. And but on the other side is debatably things like anxiety and schizophrenia, where like the people with the genetics for schizophrenia, I think there's like a couple different things that they have that are enhanced. I think it's proneness to stress, and also I think there's this weird behavioral component where you can actually, in some strange sense, inherit how other people treat you, which sounds like a really weird thing. But like, say, you might inherit traits that make you prone to being a target for bullies, for example.
Right.
Or like, for example, there's autism. People with autism are often higher risk for schizophrenia. And I think that this kind of goes into, like, I'm really a fan of what's called the social defeat hypothesis of schizophrenia, which is basically like if you are kind of at the very low end of, like, say, social status, or you're chronically rejected from the people around you, that this makes you very prone to the symptoms of schizophrenia. And I think like one good way to kind of understand that is to kind of look at, there's been like research of people being socially and just kind of sensory and socially deprived for like days or something like that, and they end up getting symptoms like schizophrenia. And you could imagine that like so like solitary confinement would be that, like people start to hallucinate or get paranoid or whatever. And so you can imagine like someone's life could be set up in such a way that that they are prone to actually experiencing something like solitary confinement, just culturally for some reason. Like
Right.
it could be even something as subtle as like their facial expressions, you know, or like if people talk about, well, I don't know. Yeah, that's like a whole thing. But yeah, so I touched on a lot of things there.
Right.
I hope that wasn't too chaotic.
No. I think stress is definitely a common factor, and the way I hear from you is the genetic component can actually be indirect. For example, the behavior, the way person behaves, could make the person more prone to stress in terms of other people's reaction to the person, and that could lead to schizophrenia. But I was curious if you've thought about, say, effects of schizophrenia, which may be hallucinations, why that response would make sense. I don't know whether I want to ask evolutionarily why that would have evolved. So do you think it serves a purpose, or is it some sort of like an epiphenomena that happened?
So I think like when we talk about hallucinations, it gets really tricky because like how all schizophrenics don't necessarily hallucinate, and it's also not necessarily all the time. I think the hallucinations are a product, especially of things like not sleeping. So like that's another thing, is like the genes might give the person insomnia, which like slowly makes them reach like psychosis or something like that. And I think like the role it might have evolutionarily, I think it's like debatable, because it could be thought of as an error of a sort, but it's also possible that, like, say you're in danger, and because it seems like a lot of these symptoms of schizophrenia are really kind of like a threat response. Like it's like a person who's just so threatened that they are perceiving everyone to be kind of against them, or kind of like out to abuse them or harm them or something like that. That's kind of what paranoia is. It's like being conditioned to expect people to be trying to harm you or something like that. So I think that evolutionarily, that's kind of what it might serve, is that, like, say you're like, you imagine like groups of people are living like together, right? Like we live in these tribes and we have all this social support, and this gives us security against like any possible like predators or things that could kill us. If you were to be isolated from that group, or even if you were to challenge that group, like if you were to be a kind of a heretic of the group, I think being paranoid and being kind of socially defeated is probably the right way. Like if the alternative is to just confidently challenge the group, like I think that could produce like a mob like killing you or something, right? So
Right.
you become like really depressed and anhedonic because you believe in something that everyone else thinks is wrong. I think that's probably an evolved response. Also, if you're outside of the group and just literally isolated, like in the forest, I think being paranoid and like kind of like seeing like possible dangerous creatures in the darkness, I think that sort of thing is probably evolved and useful, because it's like you're probably ramping up the sensitivity to noticing dangerous animals or something like that, and you're overfitting everything and making mistakes, but it'll protect you if there actually is something there, right?
Yeah. So what you're saying is, when there is social rejection, it might pay to be paranoid, because that just might save your life. being, erring on the side of seeing a dangerous animal, for example, when the dangerous animal is not there, is a useful strategy, even though it's unnerving and uh, not totally accurate. Okay, Gaige, coming to psychedelics, before we link psychedelics to how they might possibly be one day a cure or treatment for schizophrenia, I'm curious, what are your views on how they work? First, how do you define psychedelics? And second, how well do we understand the mechanism? Because I want to go back to what you said. How can like a small molecule make you see things that don't exist? That just sounds that sounds insane on the surface of it, but I think it's commonly known that small molecule does make you think, make you feel things that are not there, make you see things that are not there, which is an amazing sort of a response.
So the way I use the term psychedelic is to refer to specifically the serotonin-based psychedelics. So like mostly the way they often define it is drugs that bind to 5-HT2A receptors and also produce this particular state that is like famous for, so like LSD, psilocybin, maybe MDMA, not as much though. It's kind of has more effects and usually less trippy. But things not like ketamine, not like PCP, those I would call like dissociatives or anesthetics. And I think it's debatable whether something like specifically ketamine might also be useful, but mostly like I write about specifically the serotonin psychedelics. And so what I think they do, that's a really tricky question. I think, so one of the most popular hypotheses right now is what's called rebus, which is, it basically means relaxed beliefs under the effects of psychedelics. And what that means is that, so we all kind of hold these worldviews, which we kind of cling to very stubbornly. We have assumptions about reality and how it works, what everything is around us. And the idea here is that when you take psychedelics, that you kind of pull back on how certain you are of what you believe about the world and how you see it. And so that kind of opens it up to interpretation more. As an example, I'm trying to think of where to start on that topic, because that...
Yeah. I think it may be useful to maybe even start by defining a receptor, because I'm assuming some of the listeners might not have a good understanding of what maybe serotonin is and what is the, I think you said H2 something receptor that might be. So I know we don't, I think we both would agree we don't fully precisely understand how it works, but it'll be good to sort of see the lay of the land. What are the different entities involved and what possibly could be the mechanism of action?
Okay, yeah. So, yep, this is where it gets probably pretty complicated. I'll try to make it very digestible, though. So basically neurons, the whole brain is just like a bunch of neurons, and each neuron has receptor sites. And receptor sites, it's kind of where drugs, but also your body's own neurotransmitters, which are just kind of chemicals, right? They come and bind to the neuron and they produce some effects on the neuron. So in the case of serotonin, it can produce both like stimulating effects or inhibitory effects. And this particular receptor that the psychedelics famously bind to, it is a stimulatory one, and in this receptor, it's kind of mostly located in like certain parts of the brain. I don't remember like the whole map. It's like mostly, I think, areas like there. I know it's in the prefrontal cortex. It's in the hippocampus, I think, and probably something like the amygdala. It won't. We don't necessarily have to get into like all the details of that, but so on this kind of level, what I think psychedelics do, I think there's a couple things, and like how I mentioned that one receptor, I actually think there's probably a lot of receptors that play a role in the popular effects of these drugs. And so I think one layer of what's happening is so that one receptor I've mentioned so far, I'll just call it 2A. This one seems to increase the amount of glutamate in the brain. And so glutamate is basically one of the most widespread neurotransmitters that is just stimulatory. And it's, I think, something like 90% of the connections in the brain are glutamatergic. So they're based on glutamate activity. And so what I think is kind of happening there is, so if we look at like drugs like anesthesia, they block glutamate receptors, and these produce like numbness and memory loss and disconnection from the world. And so I think it's possible that what psychedelics are doing, on the other hand, is enhancing a lot of the opposite, basically, like enhancing your sensitivity to your senses, making things brighter, maybe making you feel more connected, maybe even like connecting you back to certain memories and stuff like that. It might be like what I've termed a pro-aesthetic instead of anesthetic.
Yeah. Okay. So, just to summarize so far, in our brain, we have, say, serotonin, which is a natural neurotransmitter, and psychedelics perhaps attach to the same receptors that serotonin attaches to. And but they probably do like unnaturally, with an unnatural higher magnitude, because we are injecting it from the outside. And once the psychedelics get attached, they release glutamate, which is the stimulant in the brain, which causes a lot of activity. And on the other hand, the dissociative chemicals like ketamine, you said, they block the transmitter and they sort of make the numbness appear. Have I captured this broadly right so far?
Yeah, I will say that. So this is all definitely a simplification. There's also things like the drugs like ketamine, they block a glutamate receptor, but this also just happens to increase glutamate release, which is similar to what the psychedelics do too. So there's like a lot of weird nuances that make this puzzle like crazy complex, but we don't necessarily have to get into that. But I do want to put it out there because maybe someone watching is like pissed off right now. I don't know, like maybe they're like, this guy, what is he saying? This is too oversimplified. But yeah, there is like a lot of nuance there. And I think there's no point in really maybe getting too deep into that. And it's also an unresolved puzzle, I would say.
I mean, like any biological system, I think we should assume there will be more nuances that we can capture in language or even simple mechanistic diagrams. But again, going back to the effect of psychedelics in making us see things, I think you were talking about rebus model relaxed beliefs under uncertainty. So assuming that we have more activity due to glutamate happening. So, I mean, what is rebus, and why would psychedelics sort of make us more receptive to things happening around us?
So in terms of, let's say, hallucinations, this is where it gets trickier.
And just, I mean, a small correction. I mean, I said, why would psychedelics make us more receptive to things around us? But perhaps, I mean, hallucinations is not what happens in reality. So I mean, it's something different, right? I mean, if we see a wall moving, that's not moving. Would you phrase it as being more receptive, or would you say it as just being, seeing something that's not there?
So this, okay, so a lot of the effects of psychedelics, especially at lower-ish doses, they produce like visual changes, like how you said, movement, and like the walls might look like they're kind of changing and morphing and changing size and stuff, or drifting. And so with that sort of effect, I don't think it's the same as something like the hallucination of, like, say there's like suddenly a dog in your room or something like that like that's not there. I think that they're kind of totally different things going on there. In terms of like the illusory motion, I'll call it that. You can actually produce this without drugs. You can use certain stimuli. Like there's videos on YouTube where you'll see like this spiral that it's just continuously going inward. And if you stare at the center for like 1 minute and look away, it basically produces the exact same sort of effect that the psychedelics do. And so what I think might be happening on psychedelics and in that effect is I think that it's this kind of enhanced glutamate activity is accelerating the tendency to develop that kind of illusion. Like, so people will also say that the walls appear to be breathing on psychedelics. And I think what's actually happening is your own breath is like leading to you doing this. And that's enough. Like the emotion that you perceive is enough that it's basically as if you were like staring at that video. And I think it just, instead of taking like a minute, it might take like 5 seconds or something. And you'll see that people report things like every time you blink, the effects of the psychedelics kind of reset and everything's normal for a second. And then if you like stare at one spot, it's like everything gets crazy intense. But there are a lot of reports where people do report actually hallucinating. And so that's where things get a little bit trickier. Well, actually, before getting into that, this kind of, to tie what I just said about this illusion and the glutamate to also like enhanced, let's say, sensation. I think that like if you look directly at a really bright light and just kind of like stare at it, you can actually get some of these effects. Most people don't really want to try that, so I think that's why most people wouldn't notice it. But if you like stare at a light bulb and then you look away at the wall, you'll notice that it kind of like leaves this weird pulse. And the other thing you'll notice is that while you stare at the light, it sometimes will cycle through different colors. And like it'll go like red, green, blue, and it'll keep like kind of changing for a second. And then once it gets to the end of this, the light bulb will appear actually dim. And once you reach that phase where it's dim, when you look at the rest of the room, it's like really hard to see. Like the light is suddenly not that bright anymore, but the room is like completely, it's just like hard to see anything. And it's kind of like if you went outside and go back inside and it's like all dark.
Yeah.
And I think like some of these effects of psychedelics are kind of as if it's just brightening everything to a degree that like the colors are shifting in that same way that staring at a light bulb does. Or like even if you look at the sun, it'll often look blue or something weird. It'll have like a weird blue ring or something. So I think it's just kind of intensifying everything to the point that these effects are produced. And so that doesn't sound that exciting, I feel like, but I do think that that's what's happening there. Realistic hallucinations, I think that's something different. And I do think that the higher doses of psychedelics, I think you start to mess with the systems so much that like it's not necessarily, the drug is no longer necessarily showcasing the effects of serotonin's role in the body, because like there's just so much going on. And like probably a little bit later we're going to get into this idea of dynorphin. I don't know if you've seen, I talk about that a lot, and that kind of touches into where psychedelics might be able to treat schizophrenia potentially. But I think that, so I think at the low doses it should be suppressing or even having opposite effects to dynorphin. But the thing is, like, some of the effects, like, so the things that trigger dynorphin in the brain normally are actually things that are the opposite of what it does. And it seems to play a role of like stopping those effects from getting out of control.
Sorry, what's dynorphin?
So dynorphin it's basically an opioid chemical in the brain, but it's like, so everyone usually knows about endorphins. Those are like, people think are like happy chemicals or something. But dynorphin is basically the opposite. It's a suffering chemical, is what it seems to be. Like, it induces dysphoria. It is part of the stress response. And the thing that makes it so interesting is that it binds to the same receptors in the brain as the drug salvia, which is like kind of this other hallucinogen that that people get really bad experiences on. Like, it's famous for being just like traumatic and horrifying. And like, you'll see like YouTube videos of people, like, they'll take like a bong hit and just like start like screaming, or like they start laughing and like falling onto the floor and like speaking in tongues or something weird, like it's like really crazy, and people completely disconnect from reality. And like, you'll get effects like numbness, memory loss, and it actually suppresses glutamate activity. So it gets really interesting. And so like this glutamate that I've mentioned over and over, glutamate and well, I don't know, I need to kind of back up there. There's basically this mechanism that induces dynorphin that involves both dopamine and glutamate together. And so basically, so the other thing is dynorphin suppresses both of those mechanisms. So it seems like whenever we're in a situation where we have high glutamate and dopamine, the brain seems to induce dynorphin activity, which suppresses both of those things. And it might be to potentially like curb neurotoxic effects of overloading the brain or something like that. And so like with psychedelics, when they suppress, if they suppress dynorphin, that might like ramp up like a lot of different effects in the brain and make us like super sensitive to things and kind of feeling like interconnected and more aware and supposedly like higher consciousness or whatever. But the side effect, like you could only probably go so far. These are some of the same systems that would induce like seizures, for example. And like this dynorphin is like an anti-seizure mechanism in our own brain. Like when we get seizures, it releases and seems to stop the seizure. And if you look at like some of the weird psychedelics that like there's most of the psychedelics only partially stimulate these serotonin receptors. They don't like fully stimulate it. But there are some that do fully stimulate it, and they so happen to kill people. So like there's that. And what seems to happen in some of these cases is like you'll die by seizures or something like that. So those drugs seem to like fully stimulate the system, and it maybe just totally prevents these anti-seizure mechanisms, and it proves like maybe fatal or something.
Right. So psychedelic mechanism might be a combination of direct stimulation of glutamate, but also suppression of this dynorphin, which leads to more stimulation. Is that what you're saying?
So, yeah, I forgot to mention. Yeah, I think that's it. The medium-ish doses, that's probably what's happening. But I think if you keep going, I think there will be a point where there will probably be like dynorphin activity. And you might start to see like a flip into like dissociative effects. Like, for example, like when people do DMT, they like clearly disconnect from reality. And DMT is actually often compared to salvia. But in the low doses, it doesn't seem to be like that at all. It's not like you're kind of losing touch with your senses. You're not really like going numb or anything like that. Whereas like with something like ketamine or something, you kind of, or even salvia, it really is just like a downward trend to just like completely losing touch. Like you lose your memories first or something, and you get like confused and numb, and you just like continuously get more disconnected to where you kind of don't even know how to walk or like do basic tasks. But with psychedelics, it seems like you kind of get these enhancements at first, and everything's like more colorful, more bright. You feel like you'll often feel like you get floods of memories and all these ideas. And then though there seems to be like some point where you start to maybe disconnect, and like with DMT, it seems like people are like blind to the outside world almost.
Right. So getting back to the question of how psychedelics could treat schizophrenia, I mean, it seems a little counterintuitive that the drugs that make you hallucinate can cure you of the natural hallucinations or other similar effects you are having due to schizophrenia. So how this might be happening?
Okay, so there's a couple different ways of approaching this. So first of all, there's the possibility that it doesn't work. I'll just like throw that out there. But
sure.
So in the case that it does work, though, I think there's a couple different ways of looking at it. So when I was first getting into this topic, I was looking at this dynorphin chemical. So that's the other thing, is that a lot of the projects I do, like the popular ones, are based on this idea that dynorphin may underlie like schizophrenic symptoms, because it's part of this hallucinogenic system, and it's been seen to be elevated in schizophrenics. And it kind of like binds together a lot of the different chemical theories of schizophrenia. Like it kind of helps to connect the dopamine theory of schizophrenia or hypothesis of schizophrenia to the glutamate hypothesis of schizophrenia. And it kind of even connects the diathesis stress model of schizophrenia together with it, because it's a stress-related chemical. So it kind of like shows how stress could relate to dopamine. It could relate to hallucinations. It can relate to dissociative symptoms and all this different stuff. So the approach I've kind of come at with it is that psychedelics and certain serotonin mechanisms seem to be able to disrupt this system. And so I kind of view schizophrenia more in line with like what might be like dissociative effects. And so yeah, we could just like say that. So there's that. And with psychedelics, I think what is going on maybe that could help is that, like, so if we look at like people with schizophrenia, there's association, like some of the genetic associations are actually with problems in like neuroplasticity, for example. And then we see people talking about psychedelics and enhancing neuroplasticity. So that's one point where it's like the opposite of schizophrenia potentially. And then there's stuff like people with schizophrenia who are not even on medication seem to have decreased binding at that 2A receptor that psychedelics seem to produce their effects through. But the thing with that, there's like mixed research on this, and this is like a point of contention, I would say, and it's not really often mentioned. Like, actually, people just kind of quickly seem to not even regard a lot of that stuff. Like, even that scientist that made that Reeves model of psychedelics, he kind of, they don't ever mention that, like, there's studies showing, like, there's even meta-analyses showing that like unmedicated schizophrenics have decreased binding at this receptor, and it seems like maybe cherry picking or something is going on there. I don't know, but there's kind of always this conclusion that psychedelics just must be the same thing as schizophrenia. And
okay.
So
I mean, that was my naive assumption as well. But what you're saying is schizophrenia could actually involve a different mechanism, which is more to do with the stress-related neurotransmitter, dynorphin, rather than through the same sort of pathway of hallucinations as psychedelics.
Yeah, and I think you can look at it like, if you think of something like Benadryl actually produces realistic hallucinations, weirdly enough. And Benadryl, if you don't know, it's just this over-the-counter medication that is for sleep or for allergies, and it totally produces like symptoms that seem to be in line with something like schizophrenia. And like, people will hallucinate like people, they'll hear voices, they'll just see like things that aren't there, they'll lose track of reality and become delusional quite quickly. And hallucinations like that with psychedelics are not really common. So, but people don't necessarily think that Benadryl is like a very similar drug to like LSD. Like, people pretty much hate Benadryl, and like the effects don't even seem close to subjectively similar. Like, one, you get like really tired. It doesn't really do that much, except you might see like a spider on the wall and you think it's real, and that's it, or something like that. But then on psychedelics, it's like everything seems like crazy significant. Like, your mind is just being like blown, like everything's over dramatic. It seems like the whole world is like twisted and unfamiliar. So they're not really similar.
So different sort of, I mean, the class of hallucination, I mean, in psychedelics, things are super detailed. But what you're saying is, under this Benadryl or schizophrenia, things is just like not the similar class at all.
Yeah, I think they're different, but I do think that like once people take really high doses of psychedelics, I think that the picture might change. So there's stuff I don't know. I was kind of waiting to get into it because this is something where I think like it gets really I don't know, I think it would draw skepticism more, but so part of myself getting into this idea that psychedelics might treat schizophrenia is that I used to actually have these kind of symptoms, and I ended up basically trying like 95 or so different drugs, like just from every different kind of class of drugs. I even tried like insulin, which was a bad idea. But I ended up like trying all these different things, and just to see like what they do, how they work. And I would like research them all while I was trying them. And, but the interesting thing is when I got to psychedelics, that is where things got particularly interesting. Like, I ended up feeling drastically better in the weeks following, and it would kind of work by shaking me out of whatever mindset I was in. And so one of these times in my kind of early experiences, I developed like all this paranoid ideation for months, and I basically was like kind of locking myself in my room, and it was like this kind of like stereotypically crazy thing. Like I'd be kind of like anxiously just sitting there, or like maybe even like pacing or something like that. And like I'd be like hearing, so I lived with someone else, and I would hear things from downstairs, and get like really paranoid about this. And so like, for example, like I would like hold still for a long time, and then I would like get off my bed, and like this makes like noise since I'm upstairs, and I would notice sometimes that the person downstairs would like cough at the same time, and I would like link these together and think like this person is like noticing that I'm moving, and they're like reacting like as if like, oh, I'm here, I hear you up there, or like I don't know. Right. It was like this crazy paranoid thing. And then I ended up like just trying, like seeing what would happen if I took magic mushrooms like during this. And so I went off into the forest and I took them, and it was a really low dose, so that's another thing to consider. But what ended up happening is that I completely stopped being paranoid, and it was just like a switch. Like right when the intoxication started, it was like a switch, and I didn't really like hallucinate. I barely had any visual effects. Everything was just more bright, colorful, and like I don't know. Yeah, that's so. Then I go home, and I just completely lacked all these like paranoid narratives in my head. Like I thought my family was against me. I thought that they were like thinking all these like gossipy things about me. And I just like kind of stopped caring. And I'm like, nah, like I don't really have evidence for this. And I thought even if they think that, I might even have power over my situation. Like if I just act confident and kind of not act like whatever I think they're thinking of me. Like if they think I'm like this like trashy loser or something, I just don't act like that. And it ended up working, and I just like kind of went on with my life feeling better. And so I tried that more than once, and the other time I was kind of at the peak of like a stressful period, and like it was really a risk to try this. And I had even like school the next day, and I tried like the highest dose that I've ever tried. And it did the same thing where like I went from being like depressed, feeling like I was disconnected from reality, and being like paranoid, and kind of like I couldn't even think correctly. Like it was hard. I was just like foggy brained and confused on a daily basis. And then I took shrooms, and it was like I just like reconnected to my, I don't know what to call it, like the self that I expect to be if I'm healthy. And like I came back, and I just started like writing a bunch and doing better at my university classes, and I ended up getting straight A's during this. So I don't know, it's been interesting. And so there's like two ways to look at this though. I think it's possible that it's suppressing these kind of loops involving like dynorphin in the brain. And so there is like kind of evidence for that, because so like in addiction, dynorphin plays like this role of producing the withdrawal effects. Okay. So like that has been found with like opioids, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines. There's probably others, but so basically that seems to occur because of that whole thing where I mentioned dopamine stimulates dynorphin activity. It seems to be like people take these like dopamine drugs, and then you spike dopamine. This causes dynorphin to increase to compensate or something. And then the drug wears off, and you have this dynorphin that feels horrible. And then people are like, this sucks. And then they dose again. Right. And then they get really ingrained in these patterns. And so psychedelics have been shown to seemingly work for addiction, like quite rapidly. Like people will take like shrooms or something and then just stop taking the drug. And there is even evidence in animal research where binding of certain receptors that psychedelics bind to, not the 2A, but the 2C receptor, it stops withdrawals, and it even stops withdrawals induced by this drug called naloxone, which is basically an anti-heroin drug. It like basically produces the opposite effects of heroin, and when you give it to people or animals addicted to heroin, they basically just start experiencing like horrific pain and suffering. Like it basically just shoots them to the peak of withdrawals. And so it even stops that from happening from naloxone. And so I don't know, I think it's possible that it does this, that it kind of disrupts these loops of dopamine and glutamate and dynorphin in the brain. But there's another way to look at it, that even if we find out, so we don't know if psychedelics induce dynorphin effects. Like it's totally possible that they are like salvia and they induce dynorphin indirectly somehow, and that's why you trip. Now, if that were the case, I think it's still possible that these drugs would be able to treat schizophrenia by basically like blasting those effects and then causing you to become desensitized to them. So like we've already seen that happen with ketamine. Like ketamine actually binds to the dynorphin receptor, and its antidepressant effects seem to rely on desensitizing that receptor. So that's like really interesting because like it's kind of like you're like slamming on this system, making you numb to those effects, and then you come out of it like less sensitive to your normal like dynorphin basically. And so I think it's possible that psychedelics could work that way too. And if that were the case, it would kind of start to bind together a lot of different drugs effects, you know, like ketamine would then maybe overlap with psychedelics and then salvia too. But I don't actually think that's the case. I still think that it could be disrupting those systems.
Yeah. I mean, if latter was the case, I think you would feel some of the effects equivalent to withdrawal, right? I mean, if you're taking psychedelics and it is overwhelming the receptors for dynorphin, you should feel something of a similar sort. But I don't think that's the case under psychedelics.
So it gets complicated again because so with opioids in particular, the withdrawals do seem to involve actually 2A receptor activity, but not the other receptors. So I should mention that the receptor that seems to almost definitely shut down dynorphin activity.
I meant more of the subjective effects. I mean, subjectively, you don't feel probably the similar. Not read any reports where psychedelics feel like similar to withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, like, I mean, because I've actually wondered if they are similar, but I don't know. Like, I think they're definitely different, but I do think it's possible that things, specifically opioid withdrawals, might do things like make you more emotional and more connected in certain ways. But I think it's like complicated. Like there's gonna be like so much going on, but like I think that I don't know. Like I do think it's possible that psychedelics do some things that are like withdrawals, and there are like bad trips and stuff.
Right.
But like think about opioids; those do numb your senses, and so like when the withdrawals come, you're like super sensitive to things, and I do think people can probably experience like enhanced colors, even, or just feeling more connected. Like if they're taking the opioid and trying to like disconnect from their feelings and life, there might be overlaps in that sense, but I think it's like it depends. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if there's any way to simplify the use of that. But yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're sort of like end of our time, but I did want to ask in terms of use of psychedelics as a therapy, how much progress has it made for being actually used in a legal and medicinal setting?
So it's definitely, in terms of public relations, it's definitely like super close to being used therapeutically. A bunch of places seem to be decriminalizing it now, and seems to be only escalating. In terms of the research, I'm a little bit more skeptical, and but I think it's going to be something like where with cannabis, everything was like, wow, cannabis cures everything, like it was kind of like that, and there's kind of this really intense incentive to do that because it's like we have this public that is completely biased against a lot of these drugs, and they have like totally misrepresented understanding of them. They are like the risks of taking them seem to be way overblown. And so like what ends up happening is I think we hype up all the benefits, and I do think there's going to be crazy benefits. Like if they do help with schizophrenia, that'll be crazy. And I do personally think they might be one of the best things. Like I don't think antipsychotics really even work that well. Like there's some studies even showing that people who aren't medicated for the same amount of time recover better. So like it's kind of weird, but I think psychedelics might just like rapidly accelerate like people's state changes so that they can kind of find themselves suddenly in a different mental landscape, and that might accelerate recovery and stuff. But so I don't know. I think we're really close to, like, people keep saying psychedelic renaissance or revolution. I think we're pretty much there. And I do think there's going to be like things like it's possible that they will start off like, wow, this has like a 90% efficacy and like it's curing everybody. And then maybe as the research goes forward, they're going to be like, well, it's only 50%, or it turns out people have to want to recover from addiction, or like something like that, or maybe bad trips hurt people, or something like that. And then there might be like another backlash phase. Like everyone might be like, oh no, psychedelics were bad. And then it'll keep flip-flopping until maybe enough people tried them and it's just kind of as popular as weed, I guess.
In terms of what we're hoping it would have a good effect on, one is schizophrenia, and then you talked about addiction. Is there anything else which people are trying to research psychedelic effects on?
Yeah, so they study it for like anxiety, depression, addiction, PTSD, and I think it definitely will work for a lot of things. It has in my own experience, at least. And so one thing that's not often talked about, but it does seem like it's kind of slowly rising up. Like a lot of the posts I write about is that it might have potential for cognitive enhancement. And I think that's a weirder topic because like it's possible that like say like low to medium doses are cognitive enhancing. What if gaining tolerance to them is bad? That would be kind of sketchy. But so like there's people microdosing and taking it daily or every third day. I'm actually a little bit skeptical about that. I kind of think it's, I don't know, like it might be fine. I think we'll find out. Yeah.
Bad as in, I mean, it's not addictive, right? Or still it's not really known.
I think it's the same as taking an SSRI at that frequency. Like people will probably trip out when I say that, but and they are way different.
SSRI is the antidepressants.
Yeah. It's like a serotonin antidepressant. And so like people don't really talk about it that much, but I've met a lot of people that get like the same visual effects from SSRIs, but usually only like the first couple days, and then it goes away. But the thing is, when you take psychedelics, you also can't take it daily and still get a trippy effect. Like if you take high doses 3 days in a row, you become totally numb to those effects, and it ends up not doing much. And I think SSRIs might be like kind of like microdosing in a way. But I do think microdosing is going to be way better than SSRIs. I think there's problems with SSRIs. Like I think they cause long-term permanent changes to the serotonin transporter, which wouldn't happen with microdosing, for example. So I think psychedelics are more safe in that sense. But I do think that we might find like, I don't know, people probably won't get any crazy withdrawals, but they might get like depressed. And like I tried LSD every day at one time, and when I stopped, I felt like it was hard to be connected, and like it was almost a little bit like if I was taking Adderall or something like that, like where I stopped and I feel like I can't focus as easily. But it wasn't as crazy as Adderall, and it wasn't as crazy as pretty much anything else I've taken. So it's definitely not as bad. But I don't think we should. I don't know. There's other things like there's heart problems that you can get from like daily use. Like similar drugs after just 2 months have produced like heart enlargement, and so. I don't know. I think it's a little bit sketchy. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So we ought to do a lot of research, especially on long-term consequences.
And I'll say with the heart thing, nobody should freak out about like one-time use. It seems to be that it's causing like some kind of like cellular effect that causes the heart to start kind of just generating fibrosis. And but it seems to be something that is like not like, it seems to be a mechanism that isn't like it's not causing damage, right? It's more like causing growth or something. But it becomes bad because it's like it's kind of the same effect that if someone were overweight and they get heart enlargement. But it wouldn't happen with like one dose or even like sporadic use. It's like you have to be like chronically using it pretty much.
Right. Great. So, Gaige, this is amazing. I really had a good time talking to you about psychedelics and schizophrenia. I learned a lot, and I'll keep watching your blog. Please keep writing interesting research on it. I think you're doing everyone a valuable service by summarizing a lot of this research. So thank you so much for your time today, Gaige.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to start checking out your podcast. And I hope, I know it's like so much talking, but it's like the topic is like really hard to kind of.
Totally. I mean, it's not something which can be really sort of simplified in a one-liner. It's an ongoing research, and obviously it's about brain, which is itself is not well understood. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gaige. Have a great day ahead. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Yeah. See ya.
Bye.